No alien suitor chose the young princess until a human stepped forward. Part 1. The Grand Convocation of Suitors. The sky above Valethar Prime was never the same color twice. In the morning, it burned a soft violet. By afternoon, it shifted to deep amber. And at night, when the twin moons climbed above the crystal spires of the city, the entire sky turned a shade of pale gold that made everything below it look like it was carved from light. It was one of the most beautiful worlds in the known galaxy. Everyone said so. Even the species that had never visited it said so. The Valethari had lived on that world for longer than most civilizations had kept written records. They were tall, silver-skinned people with wide, dark eyes, and voices that sounded like soft chimes when they spoke. They were calm, careful, and deeply proud, not in the loud way of younger species, but in the quiet way of people who had simply been around long enough to know their own worth. Their princess was named Sarilith Vane. She was young by Valethari standards, though she would have been considered fully grown by almost any other measure. She had her mother's sharp eyes and her father's steady way of standing still, the kind of stillness that made people feel like she was always thinking 3 steps ahead. She wore her dark ceremonial robes without any visible discomfort, even though they were heavy and formal, and clearly designed for someone twice her age. She sat on the throne at the center of the Great Hall of Valethar, and watched the entrance doors with an expression that gave away very little. Today was the day of the convocation. It had been announced 6 months earlier, a formal invitation sent to every major civilization in the known galaxy, requesting that noble and worthy representatives come forward as suitors for the Valethari princess. It was an old tradition, an important one. A Valethari royal's companion was not merely a personal choice. It was a political statement, a signal to the rest of the galaxy about which direction the Valethari throne intended to lean. The Great Hall had been prepared for weeks. Crystal lanterns floated near the ceiling, casting soft patterns of light across the white stone floor. Hundreds of court officials, advisors, and attendants filled the outer edges of the room. The head advisor, an old and deeply serious elder named Sorvith, stood to the left of the throne with his hands folded and his face arranged into the particular expression he wore when he expected something to go wrong. He was rarely wrong about that. The first delegation to enter was from the Dravasi Empire. Their suitor was a warlord named Vrex Tal, and he was enormous. He stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, covered from shoulder to ankle in battle-scarred ceremonial armor that had clearly seen real use. He walked to the center of the hall with the slow confidence of someone who had never once in his life been told no. He presented his credentials: 17 battles won, 6 contested worlds brought under Dravasi order, a lineage that stretched back 8 generations of military commanders. And then he looked at Sarilith. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his attendant and said something in his own language. His attendant translated carefully. The warlord felt, with great respect, that the princess was not yet seasoned enough for the weight of a Dravasi alliance. She was too young, too untested. He would not be moving forward. He bowed, politely, correctly, and walked back out. Sarilith did not move. Her expression did not change. The second delegation was from the Thurian Collective. Their representative was a tall, pale figure wrapped in layered silver robes, a being that carried within it the combined memory of 1,000 minds. It spoke slowly and with great precision. It presented its case for 7 full minutes, without pause. Then it studied Sarilith the way a person studies a document they are unsure about, and it said, again with great courtesy, that the princess's psychological profile did not suggest the kind of dominant personality that the Thurian Collective typically sought in a political bond. She was, it said, somewhat too gentle. It left as cleanly as it had arrived. The third suitor was a Mirathi philosopher. The fourth was a paired bonding entity from the Solith worlds. The fifth was a decorated navigator from the Outer Rim systems, who barely looked at Sarilith at all, before shaking his head slowly. One by one they came. One by one they found their reasons. Too young, too quiet, too soft, not commanding enough, not ancient enough in her presence, not sharp enough in her bearing, not the right kind of powerful. The rejections were always polite. They were wrapped in the careful language of diplomatic courtesy. But they were rejections all the same, and everyone in the hall knew it, and Sarilith knew it, and her fingers had been pressing slowly harder into the armrest of the throne since the 2nd hour of the morning. Sorveth watched the doors. He kept his face still. Inside, he felt something that a man of his age and experience did not easily feel. He felt tired. By the late afternoon, the hall had grown quieter. Most of the great delegations had come and gone. The remaining attendants spoke in low voices. One of Sarilith's younger handmaidens, a girl named Ovi, stood near the back wall and stared at her own shoes because she did not know what else to do with her face. Then the doors opened one more time. The human delegation from the ship CNV Carson had docked that morning. They had arrived late. Not by much, but late enough that it had been noticed and commented on by 3 different court officials. The delegation consisted of 2 people, a short, focused woman named Petra Wynn, who walked like she had somewhere more important to be, and a man in a pressed but clearly much-traveled suit named Cole Harlan. Cole Harlan was a diplomatic attaché from Earth's Interstellar Relations Bureau. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, not especially tall, with dark hair that was slightly longer than was strictly professional, and the kind of calm in his face that came not from having nothing to worry about, but from having already decided not to. He carried a small case in one hand. That was all he had brought. He walked to the center of the hall. He stopped. He looked at Sorveth, then at the assembled court, and then, without hurry, without ceremony, he turned his eyes to Sarilith. Not to her crown, not to the throne, not to the advisors on either side of her. To her. He set down his case, and he bowed. It was a real bow, not the shallow diplomatic tilt that most delegates offered, but a full, genuine bow of respect, the kind a person gives when they actually mean it. Then he straightened up and he spoke in clear, unadorned Galactic common. He said, "Your Highness, I am not here to evaluate whether you are worthy of me. I am here to ask whether I might be worthy of you." The hall was completely silent. Sarilith looked at him. For the first time all day, something shifted in her expression. Something too small and too careful for most people in the room to catch. But Ovi, standing at the back wall and no longer staring at her shoes, saw it. It was the look of someone who had been waiting a very long time to hear something, and had stopped believing they ever would. Sorveth unfolded his hands. Then he folded them again. Outside, the Vielthri sky was turning from amber to gold. The twin moons were beginning to rise. And in the great hall of Vaelthar Prime, for the first time since the convocation had begun, nobody moved toward the exit. No alien suitor chose the young princess until a human stepped forward. Part 2. The Human Who Did Not Leave. The morning after the convocation, the great hall was empty and quiet. The crystal lanterns had been dimmed. The ceremonial banners of the visiting delegations had been carefully removed from the walls. What remained was a large, beautiful, very silent room that felt, now that all the important guests were gone, somehow larger than it needed to be. Cole Harlan was sitting in the middle of it. He had pulled a small folding table from his case and set it up on the white stone floor, directly beneath the central lantern. On the table were 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, brought from Earth, brewed in a compact device no bigger than a book that he had apparently been carrying in the bottom of his bag the whole time. He had 1 cup in front of him, and 1 cup across the table, and an empty seat, as if he had been expecting someone to show up. Sorveth found him there, at the 6th hour of the morning. The old advisor stood in the doorway for a moment, and looked at Cole with the expression he used when he was calculating something. Then he walked forward, slowly, and stopped a short distance from the table. Cole looked up. "Good morning," he said. The second cup is for whoever arrives first. You are welcome to it. Sorveth did not sit. He looked at the cup, then at Cole. He said, "You are still here." Cole said, "I am." Sorveth said, "The convocation has concluded. The remaining suitors are expected to depart by midday." Cole picked up his own cup and took a careful sip. "I understand," he said. "I am not departing." Sorveth's expression did not change, which meant, for anyone who knew him, that he was surprised. He began to list the reasons that Cole's continued presence was procedurally irregular. He spoke about interstellar protocol and the formal timeline of the convocation process, and the expectations of the Veilthari court, and 3 different specific clauses from the Galactic Diplomatic Charter. He spoke for nearly 4 minutes without stopping. He was, in his way, very thorough. Cole listened to all of it. He nodded in the right places. When Sorveth finished, Cole said, "You are correct about all of that. Would you like to sit?" Sorveth did not sit. But an hour later, Princess Seralith walked into the great hall in a plain gray robe, with her hair loose and no crown and no attendants. She stopped when she saw the table. She looked at the second cup of coffee. She looked at Cole. Cole stood up and pulled the empty chair back slightly, the way people do when they want to make it clear the seat is genuinely offered and not just politely indicated. Seralith sat down. She looked at the coffee cup. She said, "What is this?" Cole said, "Coffee. It is a drink from Earth. It is bitter and warm, and humans have been arguing about it for centuries. I think it is very good. You may think otherwise. That is acceptable." Seralith picked up the cup. She took a small, careful sip. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It is strange." Cole said, "Yes." She took another sip. That was how it began. Over the next several days, Cole and Seralith met at that same table at different hours. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the late afternoon, when the amber light came through the high windows of the hall and turned everything a warm orange gold. They talked about small things at first. Cole told her about Earth, not the grand version that human diplomats usually presented to other species, full of achievement and progress, and a story of how humanity had pulled itself up from a difficult past. He told her the ordinary version, the one with traffic and terrible weather, and the way humans stayed up too late because they did not want the day to end. Seralith listened to all of it, with the careful attention she gave to everything. Sometimes, she asked questions that surprised Cole with how precise they were. Sometimes, she said nothing and just looked at him. And Cole had the feeling she was reading something in his face that he had not intentionally put there. He did not mind. What Cole did not realize, at least not at first, was that the rest of the court was watching. Not obviously. The Veilthari were too composed for obvious watching. But attendants found reasons to walk through the great hall at the hours when Cole and Seralith were there. Officials paused near doorways. Even Sorveth, who had made his disapproval clear, appeared at the edge of the hall on 3 separate occasions and stood there for a while before walking away without comment. What they saw was not a diplomatic performance. That was the thing that confused them most. Every other suitor, in every past convocation, had performed. They had presented themselves carefully. They had said the right words in the right order. Cole did not seem to be performing anything. He carried a junior court attendant's heavy ceremonial fixture when he saw the young man struggling with it, without being asked, and without making anything of it afterward. He learned the name of every attendant who passed through the hall, and used those names the next time he saw them, which flustered several of the younger staff members considerably. When 2 minor officials from different departments had a sharp argument in a corridor near the hall, Cole walked over and spoke to both of them separately for about 3 minutes each, and the argument was over before anyone with actual authority had been involved. He did not do any of this to impress anyone. That was the part the court found most difficult to process. There was no audience he seemed to be performing for. He simply did these things the way a person does things that seem to them entirely normal. Sorveth, who had been an advisor to the Veilthari throne for longer than some civilizations had been spacefaring, watched all of this and said nothing. But he began, quietly and without telling anyone, to read everything the Veilthari Information Network had on humanity. Their history, their wars, their failures, their recoveries. He read for 2 full nights, and part of the third. On the morning of the 4th day, Petra Wynne arrived in the Great Hall, looking for Cole, with a stack of documents, and an expression that communicated very clearly that she had been sending him messages that he had not been answering. She was a small, sharp-featured woman from the city of Portland, on the northwestern coast of North America, and she had been Cole's official liaison officer for 3 years, which she often said had aged her in ways that standard medical care could not fully address. She found Cole at his table. She put the documents down in front of him. She said, "You have missed 4 check-in windows. The Bureau has sent 2 formal inquiries, and I have personally written 6 messages that you have not responded to. What are you doing?" Cole looked at the documents. He said, "I have been having conversations." Petra said, "Cole." Cole said, "I know." Petra sat down in the second chair. She looked at the coffee device on the table. She looked at Cole. She said, "Are you actually staying here?" Cole said, "For now, yes." Petra pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. She took a long breath. Then she reached over, poured herself a cup of coffee from Cole's device without asking, and said, "You could have warned me." Cole said, "I know. I am sorry." Petra drank the coffee. She did not say anything else for a moment. Then she said, more quietly, "Is she worth the paperwork?" Cole looked toward the far end of the hall, where Sarilith had just appeared in the doorway, pausing when she saw Petra, and unsure whether to come forward. Cole raised his hand in a small wave toward the door. Sarilith walked in. Cole said, "Yes, very much." Petra turned to look. She watched Sarilith cross the hall, the careful walk, the composed face, the way the princess's eyes went to Cole first, and then to Petra with something that was half curiosity and half the guarded hope of someone who had not been given many reasons to hope. Petra said nothing more, but she did not leave either. She sat at the table and drank her coffee and let Cole make the introduction. And when Sarilith sat down, Petra nodded at her with the particular kind of respect that practical people give to other people they can tell within 30 seconds are worth respecting. Outside, Veilthar Prime's sky turned from violet to amber, the way it always did. But inside the Great Hall, something had shifted. Something small and quiet and difficult to name. The kind of thing that does not make announcements, but changes everything anyway. H1. No alien suitor chose the young princess until a human stepped forward. Part 3. The Challenge. News traveled fast across the galaxy. It always did. Within days of the convocation's end, it was known in every major port, embassy, and political chamber, from the inner systems to the outer rim, that a human had stayed behind at the Veilthari court. The responses varied. Some were amused. Some were confused. A number of minor political commentators described it as an interesting footnote. A few called it an embarrassment to the dignity of the convocation process. One Thurian analyst, writing from the collective's primary communication hub, dedicated an entire broadcast to cataloging every reason why a human political bond with the Veilthari throne made no structural sense. But the response that mattered most came from the Dravasi Empire. Vrex Tal, a warlord who had been the first to reject Sarilith and walk away, had apparently not enjoyed the news that a human was still present where he was not. He filed a formal document through official channels, a declaration invoking the right of standing. The right of standing was old, older than most of the current galactic agreements that governed interstellar diplomacy. It was a clause that had existed in galactic law since the days when the convocation tradition was first established, and it stated that any suitor who had been part of a formal convocation process retained the right to challenge any remaining candidate to a trial of worth, provided the challenge was filed within the active period of the convocation's proceedings. The convocation had not yet been formally closed. Sorveth had not signed the final dissolution document. It was a technicality, but it was a legal one. The trial of worth, by tradition, offered three forms: a trial of strength, a trial of mind, a trial of character. The challenger was permitted to choose. Vrextal chose strength. Sorveth brought the document to Cole personally. He did not send an attendant. He walked to the Great Hall himself in the early morning before Serelith arrived, and he laid the document on the small folding table and stood back and waited. Cole read it. He read it twice, slowly. He set it down. Sorveth said, "You are not required to accept. There are grounds on which a diplomatic representative of Earth could decline this challenge without loss of standing. I can have the legal framework prepared within the hour." Cole looked at the document. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If I decline, what does that say about why I am here?" Sorveth said, "It says you are a diplomat with enough sense to avoid a physical confrontation with a Dravasi warlord." Cole said, "And what does it say to her?" Sorveth did not answer that. He stood very still and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and he was wise enough to know it. Cole folded the document and handed it back. He said, "Tell him I accept." On the Carson, Petra Wynn received the notification of Cole's decision and spent several minutes sitting very still at her desk before she stood up and began walking to the court at a pace that her junior staff member, a young man named Danny Holt, later described as the fastest he had ever seen a person move in formal shoes. She arrived too late to change his mind. She knew that before she arrived. She came anyway. The trial was held in the Court of Open Stone, a wide, circular space in the lower levels of the palace complex, open to the sky above and floored with flat pale rock, worn smooth by centuries of use. The walls around it were lined with carved relief panels showing the history of Viothari civilization. Dozens of court officials gathered at the edges. Several of the diplomatic delegations that had not yet departed came to watch. Word had moved through the palace quickly. Vrextal entered from the east side of the court. He had removed his ceremonial armor and wore a fighter's close-fitting suit instead, dark and practical, with reinforced plates at the shoulders and forearms. He was viewed simply as a physical object, impressive in a way that made several of the watching court officials quietly reconsider whether this event was a good idea. Cole entered from the west. He had removed his jacket. He wore the plain shirt and trousers from his travel suit. He had rolled his sleeves to the elbow. He had no armor, no reinforcement, no visible equipment of any kind. He looked, standing across the stone floor from Vrextal, like a man who had arrived at the wrong event. Serelith watched from the upper edge of the court. She stood straight. Her hands were folded in front of her. She did not look afraid exactly. She looked like someone making a very great effort to look like they were not afraid. The trial began. It went badly for Cole immediately. Vrextal crossed the floor in 3 strides and hit Cole with enough force to send him sliding 5 meters across the stone. The watching court murmured. A few of the diplomatic observers shook their heads. Ovi, Serelith's young handmaiden, covered her mouth with her hand. Cole got up. Vrextal hit him again. Cole went down on one knee this time, his head low, breathing hard. The Dravasi warlord stepped back and waited with the patient confidence of someone who was very sure how this ended. Cole got up. This happened again and again. Each time Cole went down, the silence in the court changed slightly. It was not the silence of people watching someone lose. It was the silence of people trying to understand what they were watching. Because Cole was not simply absorbing punishment. Each time he rose, he was different. He moved differently. He adjusted his position, his angle, the way he held his arms. He was reading something. Patterns in how the warlord moved, the way a person reads a language they are learning word by word, building understanding from every piece of it. Cole had years of field medic training from Earth's interstellar cooperation programs. He had treated Dravosi soldiers. He knew which joints in that physiology bore the most weight. He knew where the pressure points were. He had known these things for years, without ever thinking they might be useful in this particular way. By the fifth exchange, Vrex Tal was no longer entirely relaxed. He was still winning, clearly and completely, but Cole kept standing up, and there was something in that which the warlord's body understood, even if his mind was not willing to name it yet. By the seventh exchange, Cole was moving with much less wasted motion. He had stopped trying to match the warlord's power, which he could not do, and started doing something else entirely. Something precise and economic and very focused. The way a person works when they have run out of the luxury of trying anything that is not exactly right. On the eighth exchange, Cole did not go down. He moved inside the warlord's strike, took the hit on his shoulder instead of his chest, and drove the heel of his palm into the joint of Vrex Tal's dominant arm, with the exact angle and force that a Dravosi field surgeon had once described to Cole as the threshold point of the secondary joint structure. He followed it immediately with a hold, arms and leverage, not strength, that locked the warlord's position in a way that could only be broken by Vrex Tal dislocating his own shoulder. The court was entirely silent. Vrex Tal held still for a long moment. He was breathing hard. Cole was breathing harder. The cut above Cole's brow from the third exchange had bled down the side of his face and was now drying at his jaw. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. Then Vrex Tal said in his own language a single word. His attendant translated it in a flat, careful voice. Yield. Cole released him and stepped back. He stood straight, though it clearly cost him something. Saralith was the first to speak. Her voice was steady. She said, "He has satisfied the trial. The challenge is concluded." Then the court began to shift. The low murmur of many voices, the sound of the watching crowd beginning to breathe again. Saralith came down from the upper edge of the court. She stopped in front of Cole. She looked at the cut on his brow, and the torn shoulder of his shirt, and the general evidence of what the last 20 minutes had been. She said, "You did not have to accept that challenge." Cole looked at her. He said, "Yes, I did." Saralith looked at him for a long moment. She said nothing more, but she reached into the fold of her robe and produced a small square of plain white cloth and held it out to him without ceremony. Cole took it and pressed it to the cut above his brow. Behind them, Petra Wynne stood at the edge of the court with her arms folded, watching. Her face was doing several things at once. After a moment she turned to Danny Holt, who was standing beside her, looking somewhat stunned, and she said, "Not a word." Danny said, "I was not going to say anything." Petra said, "Good." They stood there together in the pale light of Veilthar Prime's afternoon sky, and neither of them said anything else, because there was really nothing that needed to be said. No alien suitor chose the young princess until a human stepped forward. Part 4. What Humans Are. 3 days after the trial, Sorvet sat down at the small folding table. He did it without announcement. He simply walked into the great hall at the 7th hour of the morning, pulled the chair out with both hands, and sat down across from Cole, the way a man sits when he has made a decision and is not interested in discussing whether the decision was a good one. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Cole with his pale, ancient eyes. And he said, "I have questions." Cole poured him a cup of coffee without asking. He slid it across the table. Sorveth looked at the cup. He did not pick it up. He said, "What does Earth want from this?" Cole leaned back in his chair. He said, "That is a fair question." Sorveth said, "It is the only question. Every delegation that has ever come to a Veilthari convocation has wanted something specific. A trade agreement, a military alliance, a political signal to their rivals. Every suitor in the history of this tradition has carried an agenda underneath the ceremony. I want to know what yours is." Cole thought about it. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone stalling, but the quiet of someone who believed the question deserved an honest answer, and was working out how to give one. He said, Earth gains a great deal from a connection to the Veilthari throne. Trade access, political standing in the mid-systems. The protective weight of a Veilthari alliance, which is worth more than most formal defense treaties, because everyone in the galaxy respects your people's word. I will not pretend that our government does not understand this. They do. That is partly why they sent me. Sorveth nodded slowly. That is the answer I expected, he said. It is the same answer every delegation gives when pushed past the ceremony. What I want to know is whether there is anything beneath that answer. Cole picked up his coffee cup. He turned it slowly in his hands. He said, I would have stayed, even if none of that were on the table. Sorveth was still. Cole said, the trade routes and the political standing, those are real. I am not going to tell you they are not important. But they are not why I am sitting here right now, and they are not why I accepted Vrextal's challenge. Sorveth said, then why? Cole said, because she deserves someone to stay. The hall was quiet around them. Somewhere above them, through the high windows, the morning light was shifting from violet to the first pale gold of the day. Sorveth picked up the coffee cup. He took a slow, careful sip. He set it down with the precise deliberateness of someone who was not entirely sure what they had just tasted. Then he said, I am going to tell you something that I have not told anyone outside of the royal household. Cole said nothing. He waited. Sorveth said, Serelith has known since she was a child that the suitors at her convocation would see her title before they saw her. Her mother knew it too. It is an old problem, and it has no easy solution, because the tradition of the convocation is inseparable from its political purpose. The suitors are supposed to see the alliance first. That is the design. He paused. He looked at the table rather than at Cole. What none of us planned for, he continued, was that she would understand this. She is observant. She has always been observant. By the time she was old enough to understand what a convocation was, she had already understood what it meant. That whoever stood at the end of it would have chosen the throne and then accepted her as part of the arrangement. She told her mother this once, when she was quite young. She said she did not mind. Cole said, but she did mind. Sorveth said, yes, very much, for a very long time. Cole was quiet. Outside, a wind came through the high windows and moved the air in the hall without disturbing anything. The crystal lanterns swayed slightly, and the light shifted on the white stone floor in slow, soft patterns. Cole said, she was wrong to feel that way, and I think she knows it now. Sorveth looked at him. For a long moment he did not say anything. Then he said, you are a very strange species. Cole said, we get that a lot. Sorveth almost smiled. It was a small movement, barely visible, the kind that very composed people sometimes make when they have been caught off guard and do not entirely dislike the feeling. He picked up the coffee cup again and took another sip, more willingly this time. He said, I have been reading about your people, your history. Cole said, I imagine that is a complicated document. Sorveth said, it is. Your species has fought a remarkable number of wars for a relatively small and short-lived civilization. You have made decisions that, reviewed from the outside, appear difficult to explain. And yet, he paused, you persist. Every time your history reaches a point where an outside observer would predict collapse, you persist. Not always gracefully, not always quickly, but consistently. Cole said, we are very bad at staying down. Sorveth said, yes, I noticed that. It was in this same period that Petra Wynn appeared in the east corridor of the palace with a serious expression and a great many documents. She had been tracking Cole's official status with the Bureau for days, filing the necessary paperwork to keep his presence at the Veilthari court from becoming a formal diplomatic incident, writing explanatory memos at unusual hours, and managing the slow tide of confusion that had been building at the Bureau's administrative level since the convocation ended. She found Cole in the corridor, after his morning conversation with Sorveth. She put the documents under her arm and said, "I need 10 minutes." Cole said, "Of course." Petra said, "The Bureau has sent 3 formal requests for a status update. Your official designation is still attached to the CNV Carson. The Carson is technically cleared to depart in 4 days. The Bureau wants to know whether to hold it or release it. And before you answer that, I need you to understand that if we hold the Carson, we are making a very visible and very public statement about our intentions here that cannot be quietly walked back afterward." Cole said, "I understand." Petra said, "Do you? Because I also need you to understand that I have now spent 11 days rerouting official communications, adjusting your diplomatic registration status, rewriting your mission parameters within the existing framework so that nobody at the Bureau has technically noticed yet that what you are doing here has nothing to do with your original assignment." She stopped. She took a breath. She said more quietly, "You actually like her." Cole said, "I do." Petra looked at him for a long moment. She was a practical woman. She had been a practical woman her entire life, and she had no intention of stopping now. But she was also, underneath the practicality, someone who had worked beside Cole Harlan for 3 years, and who knew the difference between what he said and what he meant. She looked down at the documents in her hands. She looked back up. She said, "Hold the Carson?" Cole said, "Please." Petra nodded once. She tucked the documents back under her arm. She said, "I am going to need a very good cup of coffee before I write this report." Cole said, "I will have one ready." She walked away down the corridor, already pulling out her communicator and beginning to compose the most carefully worded status report she had ever written in her professional career. Danny Holt fell into step beside her, looked at her face, and wisely said nothing. That evening, Cole and Saralith sat at the small table in the great hall and watched the last of the day's light leave the high windows. They had been talking for 2 hours about nothing especially important. The way humans named their ships, the way Valthari children learned to read. A disagreement Cole had once had with a customs official on a space station in the Outer Rim that had lasted 3 days and been, by the end, almost entirely about principle. At some point the conversation paused, the way conversations do when 2 people are comfortable enough with each other that silence does not feel like something that needs to be filled. Saralith said, "Why do humans talk so much about the things that went wrong?" Cole thought about it. He said, "Because we are trying to figure out how not to do them again. We are not always successful, but we are always trying." Saralith was quiet. Then she said, "That is not the way most species describe themselves to us." Cole said, "No, most species describe their best moments. We describe everything. I think it is because we are afraid that if we stop paying attention to the worst parts, they will come back without warning." Saralith said, "And does it work?" Cole said, "Sometimes, not always. We are a work in progress." Saralith looked at him across the small table. "I think perhaps all worthwhile things are." The great hall was full of the quiet golden light of Valthar Prime's evening, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, exactly the opposite. H1. No alien suitor chose the young princess until a human stepped forward. H2. Part 5. The Choosing. The Valthari luminance came once every 11 years. It happened when the twin moons of Valthar Prime aligned along a precise orbital path that brought them both to the same position in the sky at the same time. A thing that required the particular slow geometry of their orbits to agree with each other, which they did rarely and briefly, and when it happened, with startling beauty. The sky on the night of the luminance did not simply brighten, it transformed. The light that came from the 2 aligned moons was filtered through the upper atmosphere in a way that spread across the sky in cascading bands of silver and pale gold, shifting slowly, overlapping, the way music overlaps when 2 instruments play the same note from different positions in a room. It filled everything. It made the crystal spires of the city glow from the inside. It turned the pale stone of the palace to something that looked like it had been carved from frozen light. The Veilthari believed the luminants carried the voices of their ancestors. Not literally, or at least not in the way that most other species meant the word literally. They meant it in the older sense, that the light was a kind of presence, a reminder that what had come before was still there in some form, watching, and that the living had a responsibility to that watching. It was, by long tradition, the night on which the princess was expected to make her formal decision. Sorvath had told Cole this 3 days earlier, with the careful neutrality of a man delivering information that he had decided it was no longer useful to withhold. Cole had listened. He had not asked what was supposed to happen if the princess made no choice. He had a feeling by now that he already knew. The grand terrace of the Veilthari Palace occupied the highest open level of the main spire. It was a wide flat space with low carved railings and no roof, open entirely to the sky. The floor was inlaid with patterns in pale stone and dark stone, old symbols worn smooth by centuries of weather, still visible if you looked at the right angle in the right light. Tall, narrow lanterns stood at intervals along the railing, their flames burning the pale blue of the Veilthari ceremonial color. They barely made a dent in the light of the luminance, which was already building in the sky above as the twin moons began their slow alignment. The court assembled on the terrace in formal dress. There were fewer people than there had been at the convocation. The great delegations were gone, most of them. A handful remained: observers, diplomatic staff, a few officials who had stayed for reasons that were partly professional and partly that they had become, over the past weeks, genuinely curious about how this ended. Sorvath stood to one side in his deepest formal robes, his hands folded, his face the still and careful face he wore when he was feeling something he did not intend to show. Petra Wynne stood at the back of the terrace near the inner door with a warm drink she had acquired from somewhere. Danny Holt stood beside her, slightly behind, in the posture of someone who has decided the wisest thing he can do is not be noticed. Cole stood near the center railing. He had put his jacket on. He had also, at Petra's insistence, replaced his travel shirt with a clean one and done something reasonable with his hair. He looked, Petra had told him, like a person who was present for an important occasion, and not like someone who had just come in from a long transit, which she considered a significant improvement. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked out at the terrace and the sky above it, and said very little to anyone. Then Serelith came out. She came through the main terrace doors alone, as tradition required. She was dressed in a robe of deep blue with silver at the collar and cuffs. Formal, but not the heavy ceremonial armor of the convocation. Her hair was arranged simply. She wore a single narrow band of silver at her brow, low and understated, nothing like the full crown that had sat on her head during the convocation proceedings. She looked, for the first time in this story, exactly her age. Not younger than she was, as she had sometimes looked when the weight of the court's expectations pressed down on her. Not older, the way she had looked during the long parade of rejections. Just exactly herself, present and quiet and clear-eyed. She walked to the center of the terrace. She stopped. She looked at the assembled court. She spoke slowly, and her voice carried in the open air without effort, the way Veilthari voices always did, with that quality of soft chimes that made even plain words sound like they had been considered. She said, "I thank the delegations who came to the convocation. I understand what each of them brought, their histories, their power, their honest assessments of what they needed from a political bond. I hold no anger for any choice made or not made in that hall. The tradition serves its purpose. I have always understood that." She paused. The sky above was bright now. The luminance was building toward its peak, the silver-gold bands widening and overlapping across the dark above them. And the spires of the city below were lit from within, and the whole world looked the way it looked only once every 11 years. Serelith said, "I was not chosen by any of you, and I am glad." The terrace was very quiet. She turned, she looked at Cole. She said, I do not choose you because you won a trial of worth. You won it, and I am not pretending otherwise, but that is not why. I do not choose you because you represent Earth well, or because the alliance your government hopes for would benefit my people, or because the court has run out of objections. All of those things are true, and none of them are the reason. She took a breath. She said, I choose you because you sat down at a small table and listened to me like I was a person worth listening to. You stayed when every practical reason told you to leave. You did not arrive at this court with a version of me already decided in your mind. You arrived and you looked and you let what was actually there be what it was. And when I told you, in one of our conversations, that I was afraid I was not remarkable enough for the role the galaxy expected of me, you looked at me as though the idea was genuinely strange to you. You said, she paused. Something moved across her face, a brief warmth, quickly composed but not hidden. She said, you said you thought I might be the most remarkable person you had ever met, and that you were not sure how I had missed that. Nobody on the terrace made a sound. Sarilith said, I have thought about that sentence a great many times. I will probably continue to. What I know is this. I would rather spend whatever time is given to us in the company of someone who says things like that and means them, than in the company of anyone who would have been a more sensible choice. Above them, the luminance reached its peak. The twin moons were fully aligned. The sky erupted, the right word was erupted, in cascading silver-gold light that poured down over everything, over the carved pale stone of the terrace and the lit spires below, and the assembled court, and Sarilith standing at the center of it, with her hands at her sides, and the single narrow silver band at her brow. Sorveth stood at his edge of the terrace, and was entirely still, the way very old people are still when they are watching something they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. Cole walked forward. He did not say anything grand. He did not have prepared words. He crossed the terrace, and stopped in front of Sarilith. And he looked at her in the simple, direct way that he had looked at her from the very first moment in the Great Hall. And then he did the thing that humans do. The thing that his species had been doing across every distance and difficulty and impossible circumstance for as long as they had been a species at all. He offered her his hand. Not a ceremonial gesture, not a formal one, just a hand, open and steady, offered the way you offer a hand to someone when you want them to know you are there, and you are not going anywhere. Sarilith looked at it for one moment. Then she took it. The court exhaled, all of them together, the slow release of people who have been waiting for something, and did not know until it arrived that they had been waiting. Sorveth nodded, once, slowly, the way people nod when something confirms what they suspected, long before they were willing to say it. Cole and Sarilith stood together at the center railing of the grand terrace and looked up at the light of Veilthar Prime's aligned moons. And they talked, not about politics, not about alliances, about small things, the way the light looked from down in the city versus from up here, and whether coffee was an acquired taste or a necessary one, and what came next, and what came after that, and all the long and ordinary and extraordinary distance that lay ahead of them. Petra Wynne stood at the back of the terrace with her warm drink and looked up at the same sky. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been managing someone else's remarkable decisions for 3 years and has learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to trust where those decisions end up. She said quietly, to no one in particular, I am going to be writing reports about this for the rest of my career. She paused. The luminids filled the sky above Veilthar Prime. The twin moons held their alignment. In the city below, the crystal spires burned silver and gold. Petra smiled. She said, absolutely worth it.